She was bound at the wrists, bruised, and being dragged down a dirt road by her own brother to be sold to a saloon owner for $50. Three men on horseback stopped him. They didn't know it yet, but the woman they had just saved was the mail-order bride they had been waiting for. This is her story. The gunshot split the autumn sky like a crack in old leather, sending a flock of crows screaming into the amber light. Three men reined in their horses at the edge of the ridge, shoulders broad as door frames, backs straight as the pines that lined the Montana hills behind them. Below on the rutted trail that wound through the valley like a scar in the earth, a horse-drawn wagon had stopped in a cloud of settling dust. Two figures struggled beside it, and even from this distance, something about the scene set Caleb Hawthorne's jaw tight as a trap. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory stretched before them like a beast not yet broken. Caleb had spent the better part of 15 years learning its moods, first as a cavalry scout during the war, then as a rancher carving his own claim from rock and timber and sheer stubborn will. His face was tanned dark from years under merciless sun, lined at the eyes from squinting across distances that swallowed lesser men whole. He sat his stallion Thunder with the ease of a man who had been born to the saddle, though in truth he had been born to a Virginia plantation with white columns and slave quarters he could never stomach. Beside him, Elijah leaned forward in his saddle, shading his eyes with one hand. Eli was the middle brother, 4 years younger than Caleb, and built from the same hard clay, but shaped with a gentler hand. Where Caleb's features were granite, Eli's held something warmer. His light brown hair caught the late afternoon sun, streaked gold from long days working horses in the open. His whiskey-colored eyes narrowed as he studied the scene below. "That man is dragging someone," Eli said quietly. On Caleb's other side, Jesse Hawthorne was already reaching for his rifle. The youngest of the three, at 28, Jesse stood tallest at 6'5", with auburn hair that burned red in certain light and amber eyes that ran colder than either of his brothers. His jaw was set in its permanent expression of restless suspicion, and the muscles in his forearms coiled as he gripped the stock of his Winchester. "Easy," Caleb said. One word. That was usually enough. Jesse's hands stilled, but his eyes never left the trail below. Down there, the man had hauled something from the back of the wagon. Not something, someone. A woman in a faded blue dress, her hands bound before her. She stumbled as he yanked her forward, and even from the ridge, Caleb could see the way she caught herself, the way she straightened despite the rough treatment. Not the posture of someone who had given up. Caleb had seen enough. He had seen it at Antietam, where men became property and property became ash. He had spent 14 years trying to forget what that looked like, and here it was again, playing out on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. He nudged Thunder forward. The descent was steep and treacherous. Rocks clattered beneath hooves, announcing their approach with the sound of small avalanches. Three massive horses carrying three massive men came down that slope like thunder rolling off the mountain, and by the time they reached the bottom, the man beside the wagon had stopped shouting. He kept his grip on the woman's arm, though, and his other hand hovered near the worn pistol at his waist. "Fine day," Caleb called out, his voice carrying the easy drawl of his Virginia upbringing. He kept it light, conversational, the way a man might comment on weather, while his right hand rested within inches of the Colt on his hip. The man was younger than Caleb expected, hardly more than a boy, really, with a scraggly attempt at a beard, and clothes too large for his narrow frame. His eyes darted between the three riders with the calculation of a cornered animal. "Ain't looking for company, mister." Caleb studied the woman. Her face was partially hidden behind tangled strands of honey-brown hair, but he could see the bruise darkening her cheek, fresh enough to still be swelling. Her eyes, when they met his, were the color of storm clouds over mountain peaks. Blue-gray fierce, and filled with something that stopped his breath for half a second. Not just fear, pride, defiance. The look of someone who had been knocked down and was already planning how to stand back up. "Seems like your companion might disagree," Caleb said, nodding toward her. Jesse had already dismounted, landing with the heavy thud of a man who moved faster than his size suggested. He took 2 steps toward the boy before Caleb stopped him with a single glance. Jesse froze, jaw working, but held his ground. Eli had shifted his horse to the woman's far side, placing himself between her and the open trail, without a word spoken or a signal given. The three brothers moved like parts of the same machine, each knowing his role without discussion. "She ain't got no say in the matter," the young man spat. "She's my sister, and I'm taking her where she'll be of use instead of a burden." Caleb dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. Up close, he could see the family resemblance between them. The same bone structure, though the woman's features were finer, more delicate. She could not have been more than 22 or 23. That's so? Caleb asked. Most brothers I know don't tie up their sisters. The young man's face reddened. Look, this ain't your business. I got debts to settle and she's my way out. Already got payment arranged in Silver Creek. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Caleb had heard of such arrangements. Women sold to saloons or worse in frontier towns where females were scarce. Some called it marriage brokering. Others called it opportunity. Caleb called it what it was. Slavery wearing a different face. What's your name, miss? He asked, addressing the woman directly. Before the brother could intervene, she cut in with a voice surprisingly steady for someone with bound wrists and a bruised face. Clara, Clara Whitfield. The brother yanked her arm. Caleb watched the pain flash across her face, watched her swallow it, watched her refuse to cry out. Something shifted inside his chest. Not love, not yet, not anything close, but respect, immediate and certain for a woman who would not break. Miss Whitfield, Caleb said, seems to me you're not traveling of your own accord. She's my kin, the brother insisted. Name's Owen Whitfield, and I got every right. No man has the right to sell another human being. Caleb's tone hardened like iron quenched in cold water. Not since the war settled that matter. Owen's hand moved toward his pistol. Jesse stepped closer, and the boy flinched at the shadow that fell across him. Jesse was nearly a full head taller and twice as wide, and his expression suggested he was hoping for a reason. You best ride on, stranger. Owen managed his voice, cracking at the edges. What happened next unfolded in the space of a heartbeat. Owen drew his pistol, but Caleb was faster. Years faster. Lifetimes faster. His Colt cleared leather before Owen's weapon was halfway raised, and a single shot rang out across the valley. The bullet kicked dirt at Owen's feet, spraying gravel against his shins and sending him stumbling backward. His pistol clattered to the ground. Jesse scooped it up before it stopped spinning. Next one won't miss, Caleb warned. Now untie your sister. Owen's face contorted with rage and humiliation, but survival instinct won the argument. With shaking hands, he loosened the ropes around Clara's wrists. She stood perfectly still as the bindings fell away, then slowly rubbed the raw skin where hemp had bitten into flesh. You're robbing me, Owen accused. They paid $50 up front. I needed that money. Then you should have found honest work. Caleb reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a fold of bills. He counted off $20 and tossed them to the dirt at Owen's feet. More than fair for parting ways peacefully. Jesse added his own contribution to the farewell. Move, before I change my mind about the peaceful part. Owen snatched the money, his eyes darting between the three brothers and his sister. She's nothing but trouble anyway. Got a mouth on her that won't quit. He backed toward the wagon, climbing onto the seat with the jerky movements of a man whose pride hurt worse than any bullet wound. You'll see. You'll regret taking her off my hands. She's dead to me. He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding against the dirt road as it moved away, growing smaller against the vast Montana landscape until it rounded a bend and disappeared entirely. Only then did Caleb holster his weapon. He turned to Clara Whitfield, who stood in the settling dust with her chin raised and her eyes measuring him, the way a person measures a locked door, trying to decide if what waited on the other side was better or worse than what lay behind. Are you hurt, Miss Whitfield? Beyond what I can see, she studied him with an intelligence that made him suddenly conscious of the trail dust on his clothes, the sweat stains on his hat, the rough edges of a life lived far from polite society. Not beyond what you can see, she said carefully. Why did you intervene? Caleb removed his hat. It was a gesture of respect his mother had drilled into him before the world taught him harder lessons. Because what he was doing wasn't right. Her laugh was short and brittle, the sound of someone who had stopped expecting decency. There's plenty not right in this world. Most men ride on by. I'm not most men. He replaced his hat and was about to offer her passage to the nearest town when Clara Whitfield reached into the pocket of her dusty traveling dress and withdrew a folded envelope. The paper was creased and worn, as though it had been read many times, carried close-handled, with the careful reverence of someone holding their last hope between two fingers. Hawthorne, she read aloud, her voice steady, but her hands betraying the faintest tremor. Caleb, Elijah, and Jesse Hawthorne. Hawthorne Peak Ranch, Montana Territory. The three brothers exchanged a look that passed between them like a telegraph signal. Surprise, confusion, and something else that none of them had a word for yet. "I'm Clara Whitfield," she said, lifting her gaze to meet Caleb's. "I came to Montana to be your mail-order bride." She held up the letter. "This is your letter of acceptance." Silence dropped over them like a blanket of fresh snow. Caleb stared at the envelope, then at the handwriting visible through the worn paper. He recognized it immediately. Not his own careful, clipped penmanship that read like military dispatches. This was Eli's hand. The flowing letters, the warmth of phrase, the words that promised a home and a partnership in a future built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Caleb had not written that letter. Eli had written it for him because Caleb wrote as his brother had once put it, like a man negotiating the purchase of cattle. Every warm word, every gentle promise, every hint of poetry in those pages had come from Eli's heart, poured through Eli's pen, signed with Caleb's name. And now the woman who had read those words, who had carried them across 1,000 miles, as proof that somewhere in this vast and brutal country, a good man was waiting for her, stood before the real Caleb Hawthorne, who was nothing like the man in the letter. Jesse broke the silence with his usual blunt grace. "So you're the bride whose brother had her tied up and dragged down the road." "Jesse," Eli warned. Clara did not flinch. She squared her shoulders, small as they were, and lifted her chin another fraction of an inch. "My circumstances are not ideal. If you wish to withdraw your invitation, I understand. I'll find my way onward." The dignity in those words silenced all three of them. Here was a woman who had been betrayed by her own blood, bound and dragged toward a fate worse than anything she could name, rescued by strangers who turned out to be the very men she had traveled 1,000 miles to meet, and her response was to offer them an out. To stand in the dust of a Montana trail, with nothing but a worn letter and a bruised face, and say with perfect composure that she would manage on her own. Caleb felt something move behind his ribs, something he had walled off years ago after Helen, after the war, after Catherine Mills, and the weight he carried in his chest pocket like a stone. "My ranch is about 3 hours' ride from here," he said finally. "I can take you there until you decide what you want to do next, or I can escort you to the nearest town if you prefer." Clara's eyes sharpened. "And what payment would you expect for this kindness?" The question stung, but Caleb understood where it came from. A woman alone in the West learned fast that few offers arrived without strings woven through them. "None," he said firmly. "You'll have your own quarters and be left in peace. When you're ready to move on, I'll see you safely wherever you choose to go." Eli stepped his horse closer and removed his hat with a smile that could warm a frozen creek. "Our housekeeper, Mabel, will be thrilled to have another woman in the house. She's been complaining about living with 3 uncivilized men for years." Even Jesse contributed in his own rough way. "At least at the ranch you'll get fed. You look like you haven't eaten in days." Clara looked down the empty road where Owen's wagon had vanished. Then she looked at the 3 men. The decision was clear in her eyes before she spoke it. Whatever waited behind her, the future her brother had planned was worse. "Your ranch, then," she agreed. "At least until I can make other arrangements." The ride to Hawthorne Peak took 3 hours through some of the most magnificent country God ever laid down on the earth. They climbed gradually through foothills carpeted with autumn grass, gone golden, crossed 2 creeks running cold and clear over beds of polished stone, and wound through forests of lodgepole pine, where the air smelled sharp as a whetstone, and the light fell in columns through the canopy like the windows of some great green cathedral. Caleb rode ahead as he always did, eyes scanning the terrain for danger, in a habit formed during years of scouting and never fully broken. He glanced back at Clara more often than he would have admitted, checking that she sat steady in the saddle. She did. She rode the gentle mare Eli had brought from town with the ease of someone raised around horses, not the tentative grip of a city woman pretending competence. Another thing to notice about Clara Whitfield. Another detail filed away. Eli rode alongside her, filling the silence with gentle conversation. He pointed out a herd of mule deer on a distant ridge named the mountains that rose around them like sentinels, and told her the story of the time Jesse chased a black bear away from the hen house with a shovel. It was not a shovel, Jesse called from behind them. It was a spade. There's a difference. The bear didn't seem to notice the difference. Eli replied, and Clara smiled. Small, exhausted, but real. The first genuine smile Caleb had seen on her face, and it changed her features the way sunrise changes a landscape, revealing depths and warmth that darkness had concealed. Jesse rode at the rear, watching the trail behind them with the focused attention of a man who expected trouble to follow. When the path narrowed between two rock walls, he moved his horse to Clara's flank without being asked, placing his body and his animal between her and any threat that might emerge from the shadows. Clara noticed. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Jesse pretended not to see it. The ranch appeared as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. Hawthorne Peak sat in a valley cupped by mountains like a rough and calloused hand holding something precious. The main house was constructed of solid timber, 2 stories tall, with a wide porch running the length of the front that looked out over grazing land, stretching east toward the horizon. A large barn stood nearby, along with a bunkhouse, storage buildings, and a series of corrals where horses moved in the golden light like living sculptures. Caleb had built this house with his own hands. Every beam, every nail, every stone in the foundation. Eli had built the barn. Jesse had built 60 miles of fencing. Each part of the ranch bore the mark of one brother's labor, the stamp of one man's will, pressed into wood and earth and iron. 2 men emerged from the barn as they approached. Silas Redmond, the ranch foreman, raised his hand in greeting before his weathered face shifted to curiosity at the sight of Clara. Silas was Scots-Irish from the Appalachian Hills, a man carved from hickory who had ridden with Caleb since nearly the beginning. He said little and saw everything. Behind him, young Emmett Boyle stared openly at the newcomer until Silas elbowed him in the ribs. "Wasn't expecting you back till tomorrow, boss," Silas called. "Change of plans," Caleb replied, dismounting and then helping Clara down from the mare. She wobbled slightly when her boots touched the ground, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow, withdrawing the moment she was stable. "This is Miss Clara Whitfield. She'll be staying with us for a time." The front door opened, as if on cue, and a plump woman in her 50s emerged, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been managing households and managing men for longer than any of them had been alive. Mabel Aldridge had come west after losing her husband at Shiloh, and her steady, no-nonsense presence had been a blessing since Caleb hired her 7 years prior. She took one look at Clara, and her expression cycled through concern, outrage, and motherly determination in the space of 3 seconds. "Oh, my dear," she said, her gaze cataloging the bruise, the torn hem, the dust, the exhaustion. "You look done in." Clara straightened. Even now, even here, she summoned dignity from somewhere deep inside herself. "I'm quite all right, thank you." "That brother of hers needs a good thrashing," Mabel declared after Caleb provided a brief explanation. She took Clara's arm with the gentle firmness of a woman who would brook no argument. "Come along now. We'll get you cleaned up and properly fed. I've got stew that's been simmering all day." As Mabel led Clara toward the house, Caleb called after them. "The blue room should be prepared." The blue room was the finest guest room in the house, with a view of the mountains and its own small sitting area. He wanted Clara to understand without words that she was a guest here. Not charity, not obligation. A guest. Jesse's voice came from behind him, low and edged. "Best room in the house for a stranger." Caleb met his youngest brother's eyes. "Because it's the right room." Jesse held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the barn without another word. That was how Jesse processed things he didn't understand. He walked away from them until he could come back with his fists unclenched. When Clara appeared at the top of the stairs that evening for supper, Caleb found himself momentarily unable to speak. Mabel had worked a small transformation. The dust-covered, disheveled woman from the trail was gone, replaced by a young lady in a simple green dress altered from Mabel's daughter's wardrobe. Her honey-brown hair was washed and pinned neatly, catching the lamplight in ways that turned it to gold. Without the grime of travel, her features stood out clearly. High cheekbones, a straight, fine nose. Those storm blue eyes that seemed to weigh everything they touched. The bruise on her cheek stood out sharper against clean skin, a reminder of what she had endured and what she had survived. Caleb found his voice. "Miss Whitfield, I trust you found everything to your satisfaction." Mrs. Aldridge has been extremely kind, she replied. Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Hawthorne. Dinner was a careful affair. Clara ate with the precise manners of someone who had known hunger but refused to let it strip away her dignity. Mabel kept the conversation moving like a river around rocks, chattering about the weather and the ranch and the news from town. Everything but Clara's circumstances. Gradually, Clara relaxed enough to ask questions about the property. How long had Caleb been here? Who built what? The questions of someone cataloging a place, measuring it, deciding whether it was safe enough to stop running. Bought the land in '69, Caleb answered, after scouting for the Army a few years. Started with 50 acres and a tent. You built all this yourself? Had help. He glanced at his brothers. Eli designed the barn, knows more about horses than most men know about their own children. Jesse built the fences. 60 miles of fencing, Jesse said. It was the first thing he had contributed to the conversation that was not edged with suspicion, and there was quiet pride in his voice that even he could not disguise. Clara asked about family, then immediately looked as though she wished she had not. Caleb set down his fork and answered plainly the way he had learned to deliver hard facts, like dispatches from a battlefield. I was married once, briefly. Helen died of fever our first winter here. No children. My parents are both gone, and our youngest brother William died at Chancellorsville. Brother, Clara looked confused, glancing between Eli and Jesse. There were 4 of us originally, Eli explained gently. Will followed Caleb into the Army. He didn't come home. The silence that followed was the kind that settles into a room like cold air through a cracked window. Jesse stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. I'm going to check the horses. He left the table before anyone could speak, and they heard the front door close behind him with deliberate force. Mabel rescued the moment with apple pie and a story about how remarkably well last year's stored apples had held up through the winter. She had a gift for filling silences with warmth, and Caleb was grateful for it. After supper, Clara excused herself. The fatigue she had been fighting showed in the slight droop of her shoulders despite her efforts to hide it. Mabel walked her upstairs and returned with troubled eyes. That girl is carrying more than her brother's cruelty, Mabel said, when only the brothers remained. There are older bruises on her arms. Someone has been rough with her for a long while. Caleb's jaw tightened until the muscles ached. Her brother, she wouldn't say, tight as a clam about her past that one, but she's been properly raised. Good manners despite everything. The next morning, Caleb rose with the sun and found Clara already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to her elbows, kneading bread dough alongside Mabel with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Miss Whitfield, you needn't work while you're here. She turned from the counter and there was that jaw again, set with a determination that could stop a locomotive. I won't be a burden, Mr. Hawthorne. If I'm staying even temporarily, I'll earn my keep. There was such fierce pride in the statement that Caleb knew better than to argue. He had seen that look in the mirror every morning for 15 years. Over breakfast, with all 4 of them present and Mabel bustling in the background, Caleb made a decision. He set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Clara. Miss Whitfield, there's something I need to tell you about the letter you received. He looked at Eli, who set down his fork and met his brother's gaze with an expression that mixed guilt and resolution in equal measure. I didn't write it. Eli wrote it for me. The silence that followed was different from the night before. This one had edges. Eli spoke up honest despite his embarrassment. Caleb writes like he's negotiating a cattle contract. I wanted you to receive something warmer, something that might give you reason to come. The feelings in that letter are real. They're his feelings. I just found better words for it than Mom. Clara looked down at her plate. When she raised her eyes again, her expression was unreadable. Thank you for being honest. At least I know you're not the kind of men who lie without owning it. Jesse's surprising everyone spoke from his end of the table. Should have been honest from the start. Beginning with a lie never leads anywhere good. But he said it looking at Eli, not at Clara. This was him holding his brother accountable, not attacking the stranger at their table. Jesse's right, Caleb acknowledged, and I'm sorry. Clara nodded slowly, but her eyes lingered on Caleb longer than necessary, as though she were seeing him fresh, measuring the real man against the phantom she had carried in a letter across 1,000 miles. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Clara helped Mabel with household tasks in the mornings and in the afternoons. She explored the ranch with the careful attention of someone learning a new language by immersion. She was drawn to the horses, and Eli often found her at the corral watching him work with the animals, asking questions that revealed genuine knowledge. She knows horses, Eli told Caleb one evening as they checked tack in the barn. Asks the right questions. This isn't a city girl. Caleb had noticed the same. Beneath Clara's careful manners lay practical knowledge of ranch life. She never complained about early mornings. She never shied from physical work. And more than once he caught her standing at the fence line gazing at the distant mountains with a longing that made his chest tight, as though those peaks represented a freedom she had been denied so long. She had almost forgotten what it tasted like. Jesse's thaw came slowly and from an unexpected direction. One afternoon, Clara found him in the barn, crouched in a back stall, feeding milk from a tin dish to a stray cat so thin its ribs showed through matted fur. When Clara appeared in the doorway, Jesse's face went red as a brand iron. "It'll die if nobody feeds it," he muttered, defensive, as a boy caught with stolen candy. "I know," Clara said quietly. She sat down beside him in the hay and gently stroked the cat's bony spine. "My mother kept strays, too." Jesse said nothing, but he did not leave. And that for Jesse Hawthorne was as close to an invitation as anyone was likely to receive. The first real test came on a cold evening near the end of Clara's first week. Clara had gone to check on the chickens before dusk, and the sound that brought Jesse running from the woodpile was not a scream, but the sharp metallic crash of a feed bucket being swung against a fence post. He arrived to find Clara standing between the henhouse and a pair of wolves that had crept down from the high country, drawn by the smell of easy prey. She had no weapon. She had a bucket and a voice, and she was using both, banging metal on wood and shouting with a ferocity that seemed to belong to someone twice her size. Jesse fired a shot into the air. The wolves scattered into the tree line and vanished. In the silence that followed, Jesse stood there holding his rifle, breathing hard, and looked at Clara Whitfield as though he had never seen her before. "You weren't scared." "I was terrified." She admitted, her hands still shaking where they gripped the dented bucket. But the livestock needed protecting. Jesse was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that happens when a man is rearranging the furniture inside his own head. "You belong here," he said finally. From Jesse Hawthorne, that was not merely a compliment. It was a coronation. Eli, watching from the barn door, relayed the moment to Caleb later that evening. "Jesse told her she belongs here." From Jesse, that's practically a marriage proposal. Caleb laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse but real. Eli noticed. His brother had not laughed since Helen died. Late one night when the house was dark and the wind pressed against the windows with the first real cold of approaching winter, Caleb came downstairs for water and found the lamp still burning in his study. Clara sat curled in his leather chair with a volume of Tennyson open on her lap, so absorbed in the pages that she did not hear his boots on the wooden floor. "Tennyson?" he asked. She startled, nearly dropping the book. "I'm sorry, I couldn't sleep, and Mrs. Aldridge mentioned you wouldn't mind." "She's right." He leaned against the doorframe. "Trouble sleeping. Since I was a child, my mind wanders to troubling places." She looked away. "Sometimes." He moved to the small cabinet and poured a measure of whiskey, offered it to her. She shook her head. He settled into the chair across from her, and for the first time since she had arrived, the space between them felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge. "What brings you downstairs at this hour?" she asked. "Same as you, restless thoughts." He sipped the whiskey, felt its warmth spreading through his chest. "Though mine usually involve cattle prices and weather patterns rather than poetry." That earned him a small smile, a real one. It transformed her serious face the way a match transforms a dark room, and Caleb felt something stir that he had spent years convincing himself was dead. "A practical man," she observed, "most of the time, though I've been known to appreciate Tennyson on occasion." They sat in comfortable silence while the lamp cast golden shadows across bookshelves and leather and the grain of hand-planed wood. An owl hooted softly outside. The fire crackled low in the grate. And in that silence, two people who had each built walls high enough to keep out the entire world discovered, almost by accident, a crack in the masonry. "May I ask you something?" Clara said. "The truth. Why did I really help you that day?" She nodded. Caleb considered his answer the way he considered every important thing. Carefully, thoroughly, without rushing. Because it was the right thing to do, but also because during the war I saw too many people treat it as property, fought against it, seemed wrong to ride past when history was repeating itself right in front of me. You fought for the Union, from Virginia. My father owned slaves. I couldn't abide it. Left home at 18 and never went back. He rarely spoke of this. The words felt strange in his mouth, like a language he had learned long ago and nearly forgotten. But something about the quiet room and Clara's attentive gaze loosened what years of silence had tightened. When the war came, I knew which side I belonged on. Even if it meant fighting against my own state, that couldn't have been easy. Easiest decision I ever made. Right and wrong seemed clearer then. He finished his whiskey. The West has a way of blurring those lines, but some things stay clear. No person should own another. Not for any reason. Clara's expression shifted. Something dark passed behind her eyes. My brother didn't see it that way. To him, I was an asset to be traded when times got hard. She told him then about their parents dying when she was 17, about Owen trying and failing to keep the farm, the gambling, the drinking, the debts that grew like weeds until they choked everything else. About Vernon Granger, who owned the largest saloon in Silver Creek and who paid $50 up front for a woman to work in his establishment. About the night she tried to run and earned the bruise that was only now beginning to fade from her cheek. Caleb's hand tightened around his empty glass until the knuckles went white. I should have shot him when I had the chance. The vehemence in his voice seemed to surprise her. Violence only creates more problems. You did the right thing. She set the book aside and stood. I should try to sleep. As she moved toward the door, Caleb noticed something. A hesitation in her step. A protectiveness in the way she carried herself that had nothing to do with bruises or brother's cruelty. Something else entirely. Something she was hiding beneath the shawl she kept wrapped around her middle, even when the room was warm. Clara. Her first name came without thinking. She paused but did not turn. Whatever you're not telling me, it doesn't change anything. You're welcome here for as long as you need. Her shoulders tensed, then released on an exhaled breath. Good night, Caleb. After she left, Caleb sat in the study for a long time, turning the empty glass in his hands. The woman in the room above him carried more than grief and bruises. He could feel it the way a man who has spent years reading weather can feel a storm building behind clear skies. Something was coming. Something that would change the shape of everything. On the mantel, the clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming to Montana early and fierce, and Caleb Hawthorne sat alone with his thoughts and a feeling he had almost forgotten was possible. Hope, fragile as a newborn calf, stubborn as the woman who had brought it uninvited into his house. The following afternoon brought a moment that Caleb would remember for the rest of his life, though. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a small courtesy between two people learning the steps of an unfamiliar dance. Clara had been helping Mabel hang laundry on the line behind the house when a sudden gust of autumn wind tore a bedsheet from the pins and sent it sailing toward the corral. Clara chased after it, laughing at the absurdity of pursuing a piece of cotton across a ranch yard, and caught it just as Caleb came around the corner of the barn. Their hands met on the same fistful of fabric, his rough, scarred, calloused, hers small, capable, surprisingly strong. For a single heartbeat, neither of them moved. The sheet billowed between them like a white sail on a vessel neither one had boarded intentionally. Thank you, Clara said. You're welcome. He let go, stepped back, and walked away with his pulse drumming in his ears and the phantom warmth of her fingers lingering on his skin like a brand mark that no amount of time or distance would erase. That evening, Clara discovered that Caleb had been leaving money in an envelope under her pillow each week. Payment, as he saw it, for the work she did around the house. Her reaction was swift and sharp and carried the heat of a woman whose pride had been tested one too many times. I am not a hired hand, Mr. Hawthorne. You work. People who work get paid. I work because this is where I live, for now, not because you are paying me. Then consider it savings for when you move on. I don't want your money. I want to be treated as a person, not a project. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen table, both too stubborn to bend the air between them, charged with the particular electricity that happens when two proud people collide. Caleb turned on his heel and walked out to check the cattle. Clara closed the kitchen door with enough force to rattle the dishes on the shelf. Mabel, who had witnessed the entire exchange from the pantry doorway, looked at Eli with knowing eyes. More like husband and wife every day. Eli covered his smile with his coffee cup and said nothing. But he noticed that his brother's face had shown more expression in that 30-second argument than it had shown in the previous 7 years combined. That night, when the house had gone quiet and the only sounds were the wind and the settling of old timber, Caleb stood at his bedroom window and looked out at the stars scattered across the Montana sky like spilled silver. In the room beside his, separated by a wall of hand-planed pine, Clara Whitfield was either sleeping or lying awake with her own thoughts. He did not know which. He did not know much about her at all, really. Only that she was strong and proud and capable and hiding something that she was not yet ready to share. He thought about the letter Eli had written, the words that had promised Clara a home, the man those words described, a man warmer, gentler, more eloquent than Caleb Hawthorne had ever been or ever would be. But maybe he thought, standing there in the dark with the smell of pine smoke and cold air drifting through the cracked window, maybe a man did not have to be eloquent. Maybe all a man had to be was steady, present, willing to keep his word and build something that lasted. A man keeps his word, and Caleb Hawthorne had never broken his. Below in the yard, the first frost of the season was painting the grass white, and somewhere in the barn, a cat that would have starved without Jesse's secret kindness purred in its sleep. The ranch lay peaceful under the October moon. The buildings he had constructed with such care cast long shadows across ground he had cleared with his own sweat. And for the first time in 7 years, Caleb allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next season. Children in these rooms, laughter filling this house, growing old with someone beside him. It was not the future he had planned. But then the best things in Caleb Hawthorne's life had never been planned. They had arrived like storms on a clear day, uninvited and transforming, leaving the landscape changed in ways that could never be undone. Winter was coming to Montana. But inside the house on Hawthorne Peak, something warmer than fire was beginning to take root. Something fragile and stubborn and real. Something that felt against all odds and all reason, like the start of spring. 2 weeks passed, and Clara Whitfield became part of the rhythm of Hawthorne Peak, the way a creek becomes part of the land it cuts through. Slowly, inevitably, without anyone quite noticing, the moment when her absence would have left a silence no one knew how to fill. October deepened around the ranch like a held breath. The aspens on the high ridges turned to gold and then to copper, and the mornings arrived sharper each day, carrying frost on their shoulders and the promise of a winter that would not be gentle. Caleb rose before dawn, as he always did, and found Clara already moving through the kitchen, her footsteps quiet on the wooden floor, her hands busy with tasks she had claimed as her own. She kept the household accounts now. This had happened without discussion or ceremony. Caleb had left the ledger on his desk one evening, its columns a battlefield of crossed-out numbers and ink-stained corrections. And the next morning, he found it on the kitchen table, every figure recalculated, every column, aligned, the margins filled with notes in a small, precise hand that made his own penmanship look like fence posts fallen in a storm. "You reorganized my books," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee. Clara did not look up from the bread she was shaping. "Your books needed reorganizing. You were overpaying for grain by 12%. I was. Harlan Briggs at Twin Pines pays Murdoch's mill 3 cents less per bushel. You should renegotiate." Caleb stared at the ledger, then at Clara, then at the ledger again. He had spent 7 years managing this ranch by instinct and stubbornness. In one evening, a woman from Missouri had found inefficiencies he had never noticed. "How do you know what Briggs pays?" "Cordelia Briggs told me when she visited Tuesday. She talks a great deal about her husband's business when she thinks she's talking about her own social importance." Something happened at the corner of Caleb's mouth, something that might have become a smile if he had allowed it. He picked up the ledger and tucked it under his arm. "I'll talk to Murdoch." He was halfway out the door when Clara's voice stopped him. "Mr. Hawthorne?" He turned. "You're welcome," she said. And there it was again, that challenge in her storm blue eyes, daring him to acknowledge what they both already knew. She was not merely earning her keep. She was making herself indispensable, and she was doing it with the quiet ferocity of someone building a foxhole one sandbag at a time. Caleb tipped his hat. "Thank you, Miss Whitfield." "Clara." Clara, then. And I'll call you Caleb. If we're going to argue about money and grain prices, formalities seem excessive. He almost smiled again. Almost. In the afternoons, Caleb had taken to inviting Clara on rides around the property. He told himself it was practical. She needed to understand the layout of the ranch in case of emergency. She needed to know where the boundaries were, where the nearest water sources ran, which trails led to town, and which led deeper into the wilderness. These were things anyone living on a remote homestead ought to know. But the truth which Caleb examined only in the privacy of his own thoughts, and only late at night when honesty was harder to avoid, was that he looked forward to these rides with an anticipation that bordered on hunger. Clara asked questions that showed intelligence and genuine interest. She wanted to know about the breeding program Eli was building, about Caleb's plans to purchase the adjacent property to the west, about the particular challenges of running cattle in mountain country versus the flatlands she had known in Missouri. And Caleb, who had spent 7 years in answering to no one and speaking to no one about his dreams for this land, found the words pouring out of him like water from a spring he had not known was there. He told her about the herd he was carefully breeding for strength and cold weather resilience, about the strain of quarter horse Eli was developing that could work cattle on steep terrain, about the vision he held in his head of Hawthorne Peak, not as it was, but as it could be, as it would be if he lived long enough and worked hard enough and the land was merciful. Clara listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that a man's dreams were the most honest thing about him. During one such ride, as they paused atop a hill overlooking a meadow where part of the herd grazed in golden light, Clara told him about her childhood. Not the dark chapters, the early ones. A small farm in Missouri where her mother Margaret had grown a garden that bloomed with flowers as well as vegetables, where color and beauty existed alongside the practical business of feeding a family. A father named Edmund, who ordered books specially from St. Louis because his daughter had devoured everything in the small-town library before she turned 13. She sounds remarkable, Caleb said of her mother. The garden. She believed beautiful things and useful things weren't opposites, Clara replied. She grew roses next to her cabbages and dared anyone to tell her one mattered more than the other. Smart woman. She was. She died when I was 17. My father 2 weeks later. Some people said it was the fever that took him too, but I think it was just that he couldn't imagine a world without her in it. Caleb understood that kind of love. He had witnessed it once briefly in his own marriage to Helen. Not long enough to build a life on, but long enough to know what the real thing felt like. Long enough to know what its absence felt like too. And after they were gone, he asked gently, Owen tried to run the farm. He wasn't built for it. Some men are made for the land, and some are broken by it, and Owen broke fast. She was quiet for a moment, watching a red-tailed hawk trace lazy circles above the meadow. I don't hate him. I should probably. But I keep remembering who he was before, when we were children. He used to chase the bigger boys away when they bullied me at school. Got beaten for it more than once. That Owen is still in there somewhere, buried under all the weakness and the fear. While Caleb marveled at her capacity for understanding. Not forgiveness exactly, something deeper. The ability to see a person's failure without losing sight of their humanity. It was during this ride on this hill, with the October wind carrying the scent of pine and distant snow, that Clara finally broke the silence they had both been circling. I need to tell you something, she said. Her hands tightened on the reins until her knuckles went pale. About why I can't stay much longer. Cold weight settled in Caleb's stomach. He had sensed this coming the way a man senses weather. A pressure change, a shift in the wind, the feeling that something beyond the horizon was gathering force. You don't owe me explanations. I do. You've been kinder than anyone had reason to be, and I've not been entirely honest. She took a breath that seemed to require more courage than facing down wolves. I'm with child. The words hung in the autumn air between them. Caleb kept his face neutral through force of will, though his mind raced with implications. He watched the hawk continue its patient spiral over the meadow and said nothing, giving her room to continue at her own pace. It's not what you're thinking, she said quickly. There was someone. Before Owen's gambling consumed everything. We were to be married. What happened to him? Clara's eyes filled with tears she refused to release. Weston was a surveyor for the railroad. There was an accident. A blasting charge detonated too soon. He died 3 months ago. Her hand moved unconsciously to her abdomen, still flat beneath her riding skirt. I didn't know I was carrying his child until he was already gone. And your brother didn't care. Granger wasn't interested in a pregnant woman, but Owen convinced him I wouldn't start showing for months. Said he could get plenty of use out of me before then. Her voice went flat and hard like a blade being laid on stone. When the baby came, they'd have given it away, or worse. Caleb's grip on his saddle horn tightened until his knuckles cracked. The rage that moved through him was cold and old, the same rage he had carried through battlefields, in slave quarters, and every place where the strong preyed upon the weak because they could. The baby is why you need to leave. Clara finally looked at him. A woman in my condition, unmarried without family. There are few options. I've been saving. When I have enough, I plan to go to Denver. There are charitable homes there for women in my situation. And the child. Pain flashed across her face like lightning across dark water. Most such homes require that the baby be given up, adopted by a proper family. That's the price of their assistance. Caleb watched the hawk descend towards something in the grass, then pull up at the last moment and climb again. Patient, deliberate, unwilling to commit until the moment was right. When he spoke, the certainty in his own voice surprised him. It came from somewhere beneath thought, from the place where a man's convictions live like bedrock under soil. You don't have to go to Denver, Clara frowned. I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely. Once I begin to show, marry me. The words landed between them with the weight of fallen timber. Clara's mare sidestepped, sensing the sudden tension in its rider's body. What did you say? Caleb turned in his saddle to face her fully. Marry me, stay here at the ranch, and your child would have a name, a home, security. You can't possibly mean that. You barely know me. I know enough. He held her gaze with the steady, unblinking focus of a man who has made his decision and will not be moved from it. I know you're strong, intelligent, capable, kind. I know you work harder than most men I've hired, and I know you deserve better than what life has handed you. But marriage, why would you offer such a thing? He considered his words with the care of a man laying stone for a foundation that would need to bear weight for decades. Because I respect you, Clara. Because I believe every child deserves a chance at a good life. Because this ranch, for all its beauty, has been a lonely place since Helen died, and I am tired of building something that nobody will inherit. He paused. I'm not proposing love. I'm proposing partnership, friendship, a chance for both of us to build something that matters. You would raise another man's child as your own. I would raise a child who needs a father. The circumstances of their beginning don't matter to me. Clara stared at him as though he had suddenly begun speaking a language she had never heard but somehow understood. You're asking me to change the rest of my life based on a month's acquaintance. I'm offering you a choice, Caleb said quietly. Something it sounds like you've had precious little of. Take time to think on it. The offer stands regardless of your answer. She nodded slowly. They rode back toward the ranch in silence, each absorbed in the magnitude of what had passed between them. That evening, after Clara had gone upstairs, Caleb summoned his brothers to the study. He poured 3 whiskeys and delivered the news with the same directness he applied to Everding. Clara was carrying a child. He had proposed marriage. He needed them to know. Eli showed no surprise. I suspected, he admitted, the way she holds herself, morning sickness she tries to hide. Mabel has been making ginger tea every dawn for 2 weeks. And nobody thought to mention it. Jesse erupted from his chair, pacing the room like a caged animal, all coiled energy and sharp edges. She came here as a virgin bride, and she's carrying another man's child. That's deception. That's survival, Jesse, Eli countered, his voice carrying a firmness that emerged only when something truly mattered. Pregnant, no family, brother selling her. What would you have her do? Be honest, from the beginning in the letter. And you think we would have answered? Caleb asked calmly. A pregnant woman writing to 3 strangers saying, save me. She'd never have received a reply. Jesse stopped pacing. He knew Caleb was right, and the knowledge sat on his face like a stone on a grave. I will not let this child be born in a charity home in Denver. Caleb continued, his voice low and certain. I will not let Clara Whitfield sell herself to the mercy of strangers when we have every means to help. By marrying her, Jesse's voice dripped with disbelief, by giving her a choice. Jesse mentioned a name then, a name that turned the air in the room to ice. Does she know about Catherine? Caleb went white. The blood drained from his face so completely that for a moment he looked like a man who had been shot and was still standing only because his body had not yet received the message. Eli turned to Jesse with eyes that could have cut steel. Jesse Bean, stop. The youngest brother held his ground for a long moment, jaw working, fists clenched at his sides. Then something in him released not surrender but a decision to step back from an edge he recognized as dangerous. I'm not throwing her out, Jesse said finally, his voice rough and low. I'm not an animal, but if this goes wrong, I warned you both. Noted, Caleb said. Eli, the middle brother, set down his glass and smiled, though his eyes were serious. You know my answer. I wrote that letter because I wanted you to find happiness, Caleb. She might be the one who brings it. 2 days later, Clara came to the study. She sat on the edge of the leather chair, as straight as a fence post, her expression composed, her storm blue eyes reflecting a turbulence that her posture refused to acknowledge. I've thought about your offer. And it's generous beyond measure, but I need to know. Won't you resent it eventually? Raising another man's child? Marrying a woman you didn't choose out of love? Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Clara, I've spent nearly a decade building this ranch, creating something that will outlast me. But what's the purpose of all that labor if there's no one to share it with, no one to pass it on to? He held her gaze. As for love, I believe it can grow from respect and shared purpose. I'm not offering you a cold business arrangement. I'm offering you a place to stand. People would talk. They'd count the months once the baby comes. Let them talk. This is my land. Anyone who works for me knows better than to carry gossip. Clara stood and moved to the window, looking out at the ranch yard where Jesse was splitting firewood with the rhythmic, powerful strokes of a man working out his frustrations one log at a time. If I accept, she said at last, turning to face him, I want to be clear. I will not be a charity case or an obligation. I expect to be a true partner, to work alongside you, to have a voice in decisions that affect this family. I would expect nothing less. And the child will be raised as yours in every way, no distinctions, no reminders. On my honor. Clara took a breath that seemed to fill her entire body with something new, not just air, resolve. Then yes, Caleb Hawthorne, I will marry you. The days that followed moved with the swift purposefulness of water finding its course downhill. Mabel received the news with a joy so fierce it bordered on evangelical. She launched into wedding preparations with the energy of a woman who had been denied the chance to plan her own daughter's ceremony and intended to make up for it in full. Eli offered quiet, steady support, building a wooden archway for the ceremony and helping Mabel transform the ranch yard into something that approached the beautiful. Jesse accepted the decision with the grudging silence of a man who has lost an argument but refuses to concede the point entirely. Caleb rode into Silver Falls to speak with Reverend Josiah Creed about performing the ceremony. The Reverend was a graying man with kind eyes and calloused hands who rode a circuit through the outlying ranches every 6 weeks, bringing scripture and news and occasionally a bottle of decent whiskey that he claimed was for medicinal purposes only. Rather sudden, isn't it? The Reverend commented. When you know something's right, Reverend, there's little sense in delay. Very well. November the 15th, I'll be there. Caleb purchased gifts for Clara at the general store, a length of deep blue silk ribbon and a small silver hair comb inlaid with tiny pearl flowers. When he presented them that evening, Clara opened the brown paper wrapping with careful fingers, and the look on her face when she saw the comb made Caleb's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. The blue reminded me of your eyes, he said, and immediately felt foolish for the sentiment. He was a man who negotiated cattle prices and repaired fencing and shot wolves when they threatened his herd. He was not a man who compared ribbon to eyes. Clara touched the pearl flowers with her fingertip, tracing their delicate edges. It's beautiful, thank you. A blush rose on her cheeks, soft as the first color of sunrise on snow. That's very thoughtful. One afternoon in the quiet days before the wedding, Caleb found Clara in the small ranch cemetery. She stood before the simple wooden cross that marked Helen's grave, her head bowed, her hands folded in front of her. He approached slowly, not wanting to intrude, but she heard his boots on the frozen ground and turned. "I wanted to pay my respects," she said softly. "I hope you don't mind." He moved to stand beside her, looking down at the grave he visited less often now than in those raw first years. "What was she like?" Clara asked. "Helen." Caleb considered the question the way he considered everything that mattered. With time, with honesty, brave, determined. She was a Boston doctor's daughter who decided the West needed educated women more than the East did. We met when I was still scouting, and she was traveling with a group of missionary teachers. He allowed himself a small smile at the memory. She had very firm opinions about everything. "You loved her very much." "I did, but our time was short. Sometimes I think I was in love with the idea of what we could have built as much as the woman herself." Clara nodded slowly. "I understand that. Weston and I grew up together. Loving him seemed as natural as breathing, but we were young. Sometimes I wonder if what we had would have been strong enough for a lifetime." Two people standing at a gravesite honoring what they had lost while balanced on the edge of what they might find. The moment held a weight that neither rushed to set down. "Do you think she would mind?" Clara asked. "Am I taking her place?" Caleb touched Clara's arm gently. "Helen wanted this land to become a home, to nurture life. I think she would approve of what we're building." Clara's eyes glistened. "I want to be worthy of this second chance." "You already are." The revelation of Caleb's deepest secret came not through confession, but through the thin wall between their rooms. Clara woke one night to the sound of anguish murmuring words that rose through the plaster and timber like smoke through a cracked chimney. "Catherine, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to. God help me, I didn't know." She did not enter his room. She understood boundaries. But the next morning when they sat alone on the porch in the gray light before dawn, both clutching cups of coffee against the cold, she asked the question with a gentleness that disarmed him completely. "Who is Catherine?" Caleb's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. His entire body went still with the absolute rigidity of a man who has been struck but is not yet sure how deep the wound goes. "You spoke her name in your sleep," Clara said quietly. "I heard through the wall." A long silence followed, the kind that holds entire histories in its empty spaces. Clara waited without pressure, the way Eli had taught her to wait with a nervous horse. Patience without passivity. Presence without demand. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice came from a great distance, as though the words had to travel 14 years before they reached his lips. "Antietam, September of 1862. Bloodiest single day of the war." He looked down at his hands, the hands that had built this house and gentled horses and held a dying woman in a burning village. "My unit was moving through a small town. Fighting was house to house, smoke everywhere. Couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. I saw a figure running between two buildings. I fired." Clara's breathing had gone shallow, but her eyes never left his face. "It was a young woman. She was running away from the fighting, not toward it. By the time I reached her, she was." He stopped. His jaw worked. She had an identification card in her pocket. "Catherine Mills, 20 years old. And, you carry it with you," Clara said, not a question. She had seen the way his hands sometimes moved to his chest pocket, touching something beneath the fabric with the unconscious compulsion of a man pressing a wound. 14 years. Caleb's voice was barely audible. "I've carried that card for 14 years. Clara reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. Her fingers were cold from the morning air, but the warmth of the gesture reached deeper than skin. "That's why you helped me that day on the road," she said, "when Owen was dragging me to the wagon. You saw Catherine. I see every woman who's ever been treated as less than human, and I swore I would never stand by again. You didn't kill Catherine on purpose. That was war. The result is the same. She's still dead, and I'm still the one who pulled the trigger." Clara turned his hand over in hers and held it palm up, as though reading the lines carved there by work and weather and years of carrying a weight he had never shared with another living soul. "You've spent 14 years atoning for that moment," she said, "building instead of destroying, helping instead of standing by each." She looked at him with an expression that held no pity, only clarity. "Caleb, you don't need redemption. You need forgiveness from yourself." No one had ever said those words to him. Not Eli, who knew the story. Not Jesse, who used it as a weapon when arguments turned ugly. Not the army chaplain who had tried to counsel him in the weeks after Antietam. No one had ever looked at the wound and told him it was time to let it heal. Caleb Hawthorne, who had survived a war and a dead wife and 7 years of solitary labor on a mountain that would have broken lesser men, felt something crack open inside his chest. Not painfully, the way ice cracks on a river in spring, the sound of something giving way to something warmer. He could not speak. He did not need to. Clara squeezed his hand once, then released it, and picked up her coffee cup as though they had been discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. But between them, in a space where the cold air hung with the scent of frost and pine, and the first thin light of November crept across the porch boards, something had shifted. Clara was not merely a woman he had rescued. She was not merely a bride he had proposed to out of duty and loneliness and the stubborn conviction that it was the right thing to do. She was the first person in 14 years who had told him he deserved to be whole. The morning of November the 15th dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Caleb rose early, spent extra time shaving, and put on the dark suit he wore perhaps twice in a decade. His hands were steady as he knotted his tie, but his heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the magnitude of what he was about to do. About 20 people gathered in the ranch yard where the archway stood, decorated with late-blooming wildflowers and ribbons that Mabel had been hoarding since September. Neighboring families, ranch hands in their Sunday clothes looking uncomfortable but pleased. Reverend Josiah Creed beneath the arch, his Bible open, his face wearing the expression of a man who had seen enough frontier marriages to appreciate the ones built on substance rather than convenience. When the fiddle music changed to a wedding march, Caleb looked up and felt the air leave his body. Clara emerged from the house on the arms of both his brothers. She had asked Eli to escort her because he had written the letter that brought her here. She had asked Jesse because she wanted him to know beyond any possible doubt that she trusted him. The gesture had affected Jesse so deeply that he had to turn away and compose himself before he could take her arm. She wore a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar and cuffs altered by Mabel from a garment that had belonged to her daughter. Her honey-brown hair was swept up and held by the silver comb Caleb had given her, the blue ribbon woven through the arrangement like a river through a valley. The bruise on her cheek had faded to nothing, but it was her face that undid him. The expression she wore as she walked toward him across ground he had cleared with his own hands was a mixture of hope and determination and something softer that made his pulse race and his eyes sting in a way he had not allowed since the day they lowered Helen into Montana soil. When Eli and Jesse placed Clara's hand in his, Caleb felt the slight tremor in her fingers. He closed his hand around hers gently, the way he would hold something precious, unbreakable. She answered with a small, grateful smile that he knew he would remember on the last day of his life. Reverend Creed spoke the words. The familiar promises, love, honor, faithfulness. Caleb said his vows in a voice that carried steady and sure across the yard. Clara spoke hers more quietly, but with a certainty that matched his own, her storm blue eyes never leaving his face. By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Caleb hesitated, mindful of their agreement not to rush what could not be rushed. But Clara rose slightly on her toes, offering herself with a shy willingness that asked for nothing and gave everything. He bent to meet her. The kiss was gentle and brief, a promise sealed in the language older than words. Applause broke around them. Mabel pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Silas Redmond nodded once solemnly, the way he acknowledged everything that mattered. Young Emmett Boyle clapped too hard and too fast until Silas elbowed him into a more dignified rhythm. Harlan Briggs pumped Caleb's hand and declared he had never seen a prettier bride west of the Missouri. And Jesse Hawthorne, who had fought this marriage with every stubborn bone in his body, removed his hat. He held it over his chest and looked at Clara with something in his amber eyes that was no longer suspicion or resistance. Welcome to the family, he said. 2 words. From Jesse, they carried the weight of a signed treaty. Clara nodded with a gravity that showed she understood exactly what the gesture had cost him. Thank you, Jesse. That evening, after the modest celebration had wound down, and the neighbors had departed with well wishes and the knowing smiles that accompanied all frontier weddings, Caleb and Clara stood outside the door to the master bedroom. The hallway was dim lit by a single lamp that Mabel had left burning on the hall table. The house had gone quiet around them, holding its breath. "Clara," Caleb said, "I meant what I said. Nothing happens that you don't want." She met his gaze in the lamplight. Her storm blue eyes were steady, though he could see the pulse beating quickly at her throat. "I know, and I'm grateful for that more than I can express." She took his hand. "Give me time. I trust you, Caleb. That's a beginning." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. "More than a beginning." She smiled. He opened the door for him. She stepped through, and he followed, and the door closed softly behind them. Outside, the first real cold of Montana winter pressed against the house, testing its seams, finding them strong. The wind carried snow from the high peaks, but inside the walls that Caleb Hawthorne had built with his own hands, warmth was taking root. In the weeks that followed, as November gave way to December, and the snow came in earnest, burying the ranch in 3 feet of white silence, the bond between Caleb and Clara deepened in ways that neither had anticipated and neither could have planned. It happened through small moments. Morning coffee shared on the porch before dawn, watching their breath mingle with the steam from their cups. Evenings by the fire when Clara read aloud from Caleb's collection of books, her voice filling rooms that had known only masculine silence for nearly a decade. The night she woke to find him trapped in a nightmare and crossed the room to sit beside him, her hand on his forehead, her voice steady and low. "Just a dream. You're home. You're safe." She asked no questions, made no demands for explanation, simply held his hand in the darkness until the trembling stopped and his breathing evened. Clara's pregnancy became unmistakable as winter deepened. The gentle curve of her abdomen grew beneath her dresses, and Caleb found himself drawn to the evidence of new life with a fascination that surprised him. The way her hand rested protectively over the swell when she was lost in thought. The new fullness in her face, the look in her eyes when the baby moved half wonder and half conversation with someone only she could hear. One evening she caught him watching. "What are you looking at?" she asked, amused. "A miracle," he said, and immediately felt the tips of his ears go hot. Her smile was radiant, the kind of smile that reached into the dark places of a man's soul and planted something green. "This miracle has been kicking very enthusiastically at 3 in the morning." Eli became the baby's most devoted champion before it even arrived. He talked to Clara's belly with the unself-conscious joy of a man who had found an audience that would not judge his singing. He carved tiny wooden horses and lined them up on the mantel. He debated names with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsessive. And Jesse's transformation was the quietest and therefore the most profound. Clara discovered him one evening in the barn, hunched over a ball of yarn, with 2 knitting needles producing something that was recognizably, if roughly, a very small pair of socks. Mabel had taught him. Jesse had threatened consequences if she told anyone. When Clara appeared in the barn doorway, Jesse's face went the color of brick. He shoved the yarn behind his back with the speed of a man concealing a weapon. "What are you making?" Clara asked innocently. "Nothing. It looks like baby socks." "It's nothing." Clara sat down beside him on the hay bale. She said nothing about the yarn or the needles. Instead, she leaned her head against his massive shoulder, and Jesse Hawthorne, who had never been hugged voluntarily by anyone outside of his immediate family, sat perfectly rigid for approximately 4 seconds before his hand came up and rested awkwardly but gently on the top of her hair. "Don't tell anyone," he muttered. "Our secret," Clara promised. On Christmas Eve, the household gathered in the parlor where a small pine tree stood decorated with paper stars and candles and holders that Caleb had ordered from a catalog 3 months earlier, before any of this, when he had still been a man planning for a solitary winter. "It's beautiful." Clara breathed firelight and candle glow reflected in her eyes. "A German tradition," Mabel explained from her armchair, cradling a cup of mulled cider. Caleb sat beside Clara on the sofa, his arm resting along the back behind her shoulders. Not touching, but close enough that she could lean into him if she chose, and when she did, settling her weight against his side as though she had been doing it for years instead of weeks. Something inside Caleb's chest unlocked with an almost audible click. He reached into his pocket and placed a small package in her hands. "I was going to wait until morning, but now feels right." Inside the tissue paper was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. Clara opened it to find it empty. "I thought Caleb said that when the baby comes, we could put a small portrait inside, and perhaps someday another on the other side, if we're blessed. Tears filled Clara's eyes. She pressed the locket to her chest over her heart, and when she looked at him, the storm in her blue-gray eyes had broken into something clear and calm. "You truly mean it," she whispered. "Every word." "Our child," Caleb corrected gently. "From the moment you agreed to be my wife, your baby became ours." Clara had a gift for him as well. A scarf knitted from deep blue wool, each stitch even and precise. "I know it's simple." He stopped her with a kiss. Brief, tender, their second. "It's exactly what I needed." Jesse's gift appeared outside Clara's door on Christmas morning without note or explanation. A pair of impossibly small knitted socks in soft white wool. The stitches improved remarkably since Clara had caught him practicing in the barn. Later that night, in the warmth of their room with the fire burned low and snow falling past the window in slow, fat flakes that caught the last light from the embers, Clara spoke words that changed the architecture of Caleb Hawthorne's world. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The quiet room held the confession like cupped hands hold water carefully, knowing a single careless movement would spill it. Caleb drew her closer. "I know I've already fallen in love with you, Clara Hawthorne." She pressed her face against his chest, and he felt her tears soak through his shirt, warm against his skin. Not tears of sorrow, something else entirely. The kind that come when a person who has been holding themselves together for so long finally finds arms strong enough to hold them instead. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping Hawthorne Peak in a silence so deep it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what these two improbable people would build from the wreckage of their separate pasts. A man keeps his word, and Caleb Hawthorne had given his. To Clara, to the child growing inside her, to the life they were stitching together one small, stubborn, beautiful day at a time. Winter always ends, but some things that begin in winter, in the cold and the dark and the long silence of snow, grow roots so deep that no season can pull them loose. This was one of those things. The letter appeared on the gatepost like a curse nailed to a church door. Silas Redmond found it on a morning in mid-December when the snow had paused long enough for the world to remember what silence sounded like. He brought it to Caleb without a word, holding the folded paper between two fingers as though it might bite. The handwriting was jagged and deliberate, scratched into cheap paper with the confidence of a man who expected his words to carry the weight of law. "Return the goods or pay what's owed. $50 plus interest. Deadline New Year's Day. V.G. Vernon Granger." The name settled into Caleb's stomach like a swallowed stone. He read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it in his vest pocket beside the card that already lived there, the one that read Catherine Mills and weighed more than any piece of paper had a right to. Eli and Jesse materialized on the porch within minutes, drawn by an instinct that brothers share when one of them is holding trouble in his hands. Clara appeared at the front door, and the look on her face told Caleb she had already read the situation in the set of his shoulders and the stillness of his hands. "He knows I'm here," Clara said. Her voice was calm, but her hand moved to her belly in the unconscious, protective gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Owen must have told him, or someone in town." "Owen or gossip," Caleb agreed. "Doesn't matter which, he knows." Jesse cracked his knuckles, a sound like small branches breaking. "Let him come. I'll teach him what goods look like when they fight back." "Nobody is fighting anyone," Caleb said, "and nobody is paying anyone anything." He looked at Clara with an expression that left no room for negotiation. "Clara is my wife. The child is mine. Granger has no claim here." "He has a contract," Eli pointed out, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man who understood that facts had to be faced before they could be fought. "Owen signed something. On the frontier, paper like that carries weight with certain people." Caleb made his decisions the way he built his fences, post by post, wire by wire, each one set deep enough to hold against whatever the land threw at it. He would write to the United States Marshal in Helena for legal confirmation that no human being could be bought or sold under the law. He would increase the watch on the ranch, and Clara would not leave the property alone. "If I leave," Clara said quietly, "the problem disappears." Three voices answered at once. "You are not leaving." The words came from all three brothers simultaneously, and the sound of their combined conviction filled the porch like a thunderclap. Jesse looked as startled by his own participation as anyone. He glanced at Eli, then at Caleb, then back at Clara, and something passed across his face that might have been the realization that this woman had become, without his permission and against his considerable resistance, someone he would fight for. Clara's eyes glistened, but she did not let the tears fall. She never did. All right then, we face it together. The first test came in early February, when the worst of winter had passed and the roads had cleared enough for travel. Caleb was working the north pasture with Silas when 3 riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch house. Jesse saw them first. His instinct for trouble had been sharpened to a razor's edge since the letter arrived, and he was moving before the riders had cleared the tree line. He ordered Clara and Mabel into the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, took his Winchester from above the fireplace, and stepped onto the porch. Eli was already outside, leaning against the porch rail with the studied casualness of a man who happened to have his revolver within easy reach. His easy smile was absent. The 3 men who rode into the yard were hard-faced and armed, carrying themselves with the casual menace of men who had done this sort of thing before and expected to do it again. Their leader, a thick-necked man with a scar running from his left ear to his chin, reined up 20 feet from the porch and rested his hands on his saddle horn. "We're here for the Whitfield girl. Mr. Granger has a contract." Eli's voice was mild as milk. "No one by that name lives here. Only Mrs. Hawthorne, and she's the wife of my brother. Contract predates the marriage. Granger paid in advance." Jesse stepped forward, the Winchester held low but ready, its barrel catching the weak winter sunlight. His voice carried no warmth whatsoever. "You've got 3 seconds to turn those horses around. 1. The scar-faced man looked at his companions. They looked back. Professional calculation moved behind their eyes, the arithmetic of violence being tallied and weighed. 2. The math came out against them. 2 armed Hawthorne brothers on their own ground, positioned on higher ground with solid timber at their backs. 3 hired men in the open, sitting targets on horseback. "Mr. Granger won't be pleased," the leader said. 3. They turned their horses and rode out at a pace just slow enough to preserve their dignity. Jesse watched them until they disappeared beyond the ridge, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard with the patience of a man who knew the difference between restraint and weakness. "They'll be back," he said to Eli, "and next time it won't be just 3. Eli's face had lost every trace of its usual warmth. "I know." When Caleb returned and heard what had happened, he made 3 decisions in the time it took to dismount. He wrote to the marshal and Helena. He sent Silas to town for additional ammunition, and he wrote to Harlan Briggs at Twin Pines to request the support of a neighbor in the event that Granger returned with greater numbers. Briggs, a solid man who had survived his own share of frontier disputes, agreed without hesitation. "You do the same for me, Hawthorne. That's how it works out here." February turned to March. The reply from the marshal arrived, confirming what Caleb already knew. No contract for the sale of a human being held legal force. Owen's signature on Granger's paper was worth less than the ink used to write it. Caleb filed the letter with his important documents and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not fully acknowledged carrying. But Granger operated in territory where the law was thin as creek ice in spring. His power came not from legal authority, but from money, influence, and the willingness to use force. The contract was never truly about the law. It was about pride. If 3 ranchers could refuse Vernon Granger and face no consequences, his authority in Silver Creek would crack like a dropped plate. Then on a morning in late March, when the first brave wildflowers were pushing through the snow on south-facing slopes, Silas found something that changed the temperature of everything. Boot prints in the softening snow around the storage barn. Someone had been there during the night, moving carefully, staying close to the walls. And on the barn door, scratched into the wood with a knife blade, 2 lines that stopped Caleb's heart. "Help me. O.W. Owen Whitfield." Clara's brother was hiding somewhere near the ranch, and he had come not to take but to beg. The search took less than 2 hours. Caleb, Eli, and Jesse found Owen in a shallow cave, half a mile from the main house, curled around himself like a wounded animal. He was thinner than the last time they had seen him, dramatically so. His clothes were torn and filthy. His face bore cuts and bruises in various stages of healing, and an infection was spreading from a rash on his forehead that someone had not bothered to clean before inflicting. Jesse wanted to leave him in the snow. Eli wanted to bring him inside. Caleb, as always, made the decision. Bring him in, not the main house, the barn, and he doesn't go near Clara until I say. They carried Owen to the barn and laid him on clean straw. Mabel brought food and hot water and bandages, tending his wounds with hands that were gentle, but a face that was granite. When Owen tried to thank her, she cut him off with a single look. I feed stray dogs too. Don't read anything into it. When Owen was strong enough to speak coherently, the story came out in fragments like a broken mirror reassembled piece by piece. After leaving the Hawthorne brothers on the road last autumn, Owen had returned to Silver Creek and told Granger that Clara had escaped. He had not mentioned the Hawthorns, but Granger was not a man who accepted losses gracefully. He wanted his $50 back, or he wanted Clara, and Owen had neither. He had tried to gamble his way to the money because gambling was the only tool Owen Whitfield knew how to reach for, and he had lost more. Granger's patience ran out shortly after. The beatings began. Owen fled Silver Creek with nothing but the clothes on his back, pursued by Granger's men through the winter mountains. He had survived on desperation in the dim memory that Claire had once mentioned Montana in connection with a letter. I know I don't deserve help, Owen said, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I know what I did, but Granger will kill me if he catches me. And now he knows Clara is here too. Jesse stood in the barn doorway, his silhouette enormous against the March light. You sold your sister, and now you come here asking her to save you. I'm not asking Clara, I'm asking you. The distinction was meaningless and they all knew it. But Caleb saw something in Owen's battered face that complicated his anger, not courage. Owen had never possessed that, but something adjacent to it. The desperate honesty of a man who had finally hit bottom hard enough to see himself clearly, and what he saw had broken him in ways that Granger's fists never could. Clara made the decision. She came to the barn despite Caleb's intention to speak with Owen first, and she stood before her brother with her belly round beneath her winter coat and her chin raised with the dignity that no amount of betrayal had managed to strip from her. You nearly destroyed my life, she said. Her voice was steady as a stone wall. You sold me like I was livestock. Owen wept, not the performative tears of a man seeking sympathy, but the ugly, broken sobbing of someone confronting a truth they can no longer outrun. You can stay until you heal, Clara said. After that, you build your own life, away from Silver Creek, away from Granger. But Owen, she waited until he looked at her. If you bring harm to this family, there will be no second chance. Jesse, who had watched the entire exchange, turned to Caleb and spoke in a voice low enough that only his brother could hear. She's stronger than all of us. Caleb nodded. He had known that since the first day on the dusty road. Owen stayed. He worked. Small tasks at first, then harder ones, always under Jesse's watchful eye. The two men developed an unlikely understanding built not on friendship, but on the grudging recognition that weakness acknowledged is the first step towards strength. One afternoon, while mending fence in the east pasture, Jesse asked the question bluntly. Why did you sell your own sister? Owen's hand stilled on the wire. Because I was scared. Scared of the debt. Scared of Granger. Scared of failing. And it was easier to sacrifice Clara than to face any of it. He looked at his hands, blistered now from honest work. She was always stronger than me. I hated her for it. Jesse said nothing for a long time. Then he handed Owen a pair of work gloves. Put these on. You're bleeding on my fence. It was not forgiveness. Jesse Hawthorne did not trade in forgiveness, but it was something close to recognition. One imperfect man extending a basic mercy to another. In early April, when the snow had retreated to the highest peaks and the valleys were exploding with wildflowers, the reckoning came. Harlan Briggs rode hard into the ranch yard at dawn, his horse lathered and blowing. 7 riders, he reported. Vernon Granger at their head, moving through Briggs's property toward Hawthorne Peak. Caleb assembled his forces with the efficiency of a man who had commanded soldiers in wartime. Jesse, Eli, Silas Redmond, Emmett Boyle, Harlan Briggs. 6 men armed and positioned with the advantage of high ground and home territory. Owen Whitfield, pale and shaking, appeared at the barn door. This is my fault. Let me stand with you. Jesse looked at him for a long moment. Then he tossed Owen a spare revolver. Don't shoot anyone on our side. Clara and Mabel were secured in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. Caleb kissed Clara's forehead before she descended, a gesture so brief and so full that it contained everything he might never get the chance to say. Come back to us, she whispered. A man keeps his word. Vernon Granger arrived with the morning sun at his back, a deliberate choice that forced the defenders to squint into the light. He was not what Caleb expected, no rough frontier bully. Granger was a well-dressed man in his 50s with silver at his temples, and the cold, patient eyes of someone who had built his empire in calculation rather than rage. He sat his horse with the comfort of money and the confidence of a man who rarely heard the word no. "Mr. Hawthorne." Granger's voice was courteous, reasonable, the voice of a man conducting business. "I've come to collect what I'm owed." "There's nothing owed here, Granger. No contract for the sale of a human being holds legal weight. I have written confirmation from the United States Marshal." "Marshals are a long way off. We're closer. You're on my land, with 7 armed men. Montana law gives me the right to defend my property with whatever force I deem necessary." Granger's eyes moved across the defenders. Caleb standing on the porch with his Colt. Jesse behind a stack of sandbags he had positioned the week prior, Winchester leveled. Eli at the barn corner, rifle steady. Silas and Emmett at the bunkhouse. Briggs with a shotgun that could clear a saddle at 40 yards. The arithmetic of violence tallied again. This time the numbers were worse. "Owen Whitfield owes me money." Granger redirected, his voice still smooth. "The boy is here. I can smell cowardice from a distance." Owen stepped forward from behind Jesse. His hands trembled. His face was white, but he stood. For perhaps the first time in his miserable life, Owen Whitfield stood his ground. "I know what I owe," Owen said, "and I'll pay it back, in money, not in my sister." Caleb spoke before Granger could respond. "I'll settle Owen's debt, $75. That covers the 50-plus reasonable interest. You'll sign a release witnessed by Reverend Creed." He nodded toward the Reverend who had arrived with the Briggs, whether by coincidence or by design. "Then you ride out and never set foot on this land again." 100, Granger countered. 75, and that's my final offer." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either gunfire or agreement. 10 seconds. 20. The wind blew dust across the yard. A horse stamped. Jesse's finger rested alongside the trigger guard with the stillness of carved stone. Granger was many things, but he was not stupid. 6 men defending home ground against 7 men in the open. A U.S. Marshal already involved. A Reverend present as witness. The cost-benefit analysis which Granger ran as naturally as breathing produced a clear result. Agreed. The transaction was completed quickly. Caleb counted out the money. Granger signed the release in a hand as precise and cold as his eyes. Reverend Creed witnessed, and Vernon Granger mounted his horse and gathered his men with the unhurried movements of a man who had lost a skirmish, but not a war. Before he rode out, Granger looked at Owen with an expression that held neither anger nor contempt, but something worse. Pity. "You're a lucky boy, luckier than you deserve." Owen said nothing, but he did not look away. When the dust of Granger's departure had settled and the defenders had lowered their weapons, Clara emerged from the cellar. She walked across the yard to where Caleb stood, took his face between her hands, and pressed her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her and held her while the tension of the morning drained from both their bodies like water from cupped hands. "It's over," he said. "Is it?" Granger is a businessman. He got his money and his release. Coming back brings him nothing but risk. Stronger together than apart. The words rose in his mind with the clarity of a bell struck in cold air, and he knew they were true. Owen left the ranch a week later. Clara walked him to the gate, and the 2 siblings stood facing each other across a distance that could not be measured in feet. "I'm sorry, Clara," Owen said, his voice breaking on every syllable. "For everything." "I know." She touched his arm. "Live better, Owen, for yourself. When the baby comes." "Could I know? Could you write?" Clara looked back at Caleb, who stood at a respectful distance, giving the moment its privacy. He nodded. "Write to Silver Falls," Clara said. "They'll forward it." Owen mounted the horse Caleb had given him and rode toward the eastern horizon. He turned back once. Clara stood at the gate with her hand on her belly and 3 Hawthorne brothers behind her like a wall of oak and iron. And Owen Whitfield understood with absolute clarity that his sister had found what he had tried to sell away from her: a home, a family, a life worth living. He turned his horse and rode on. Spring came to Montana like a held promise finally kept. The snow retreated up the mountains. Wildflowers erupted across the meadows in waves of purple and gold and white. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the pastures turned green so vivid it hurt the eyes. New calves wobbled on stick legs beside their mothers, and Eli's prize mare was expecting her first foal. Clara's time was near. Dr. Phineas Arden in Silver Falls had agreed to attend the birth, but the distance between town and ranch and the unpredictability of Montana weather meant there was always a chance he would not arrive in time. Mabel, who had assisted at more frontier births than she could count, it assured everyone she was perfectly capable. Still, Caleb checked the weather obsessively and kept the fastest horses ready. "You're wearing a path in the floorboards," Clara observed one evening as Caleb paced the bedroom. "Babies don't always follow schedules." Clara took his hand and placed it where the child was moving. "Feel that strong and healthy. We're going to be fine." 2 days later, his fears nearly came true. Caleb was in the north pasture when Emmett Boyle came galloping across the field with his horse in a lather. "Boss, Mrs. Aldridge says come quick. The baby's coming early." The sky to the west was darkening, heavy clouds piling over the mountains with the deliberate menace of an advancing army. A spring storm, the kind that could dump 2 feet of snow in 4 hours and turn roads to rivers of mud. Caleb covered the distance to the ranch house faster than he had ever ridden. He burst through the front door to find Mabel at the foot of the stairs, her face tight with controlled urgency. "How is she?" "Labor came on sudden and strong. The pains are coming fast. Too fast for a first baby." Mabel's eyes held something Caleb had learned to read over 7 years of trusting this woman with his household. Worry held in check by competence. "And I'm concerned about the bleeding. It's heavier than it should be." A cry from upstairs accelerated his steps. He found Clara in their bed, face flushed and damp, her knuckles white where she gripped the sheets. When she saw him, she reached out with a trembling hand, and he took it immediately, sitting beside her on the bed. "Caleb." His name was a prayer and an anchor. "I'm here. I won't leave." The storm struck as the labor intensified. Thunder shook the window panes. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Lightning turned the bedroom white in staccato flashes that illuminated Clara's face pale. Now too pale, the sweat and the effort and the fear etched into her features. Eli stationed himself in the hallway, ferrying hot water and clean linens. Jesse carried lanterns and extra blankets, his face set in an expression of fierce concentration that was indistinguishable from prayer. "Something's wrong," Clara gasped between contractions. "It shouldn't hurt this much." Caleb smoothed the hair from her forehead, pushing damp strands behind her ear. "You're the strongest woman I know, Clara Hawthorne. You can do this. The mountain doesn't care, but I do." "I can see the head," Mabel announced. "One more push, child. Everything you have." Clara gathered strength from somewhere beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, beyond the edge of what the body was designed to endure. She bore down with a cry that tore through the storm outside, and then there was release, and then there was silence, and then there was a thin, wavering wail that filled the room like sunrise fills a valley. "A girl," Mabel said, wrapping the infant in clean linen with hands that were steady despite the tears running down her weathered cheeks. "A beautiful little girl." But Clara's eyes were closing. Her face had gone ashen, and when Caleb touched her cheek, her skin was cold and damp. The sheets beneath her were soaked through with blood. "Clara." Alarm sharpened his voice to a blade. "Clara, open your eyes." Mabel thrust the swaddled infant into Jesse's enormous hands. Jesse, who had never held a baby in his life, received the child with an instinct that transcended experience, cradling the tiny body against his broad chest as though he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment. "She's losing too much blood," Mabel said, already working her hands, moving with the speed and precision of someone fighting a battle she refused to lose. "Keep talking to her. Don't let her drift." The hours that followed were the longest of Caleb Hawthorne's life. He held Clara's hand and spoke to her in a voice scraped raw, telling her about the ranch in summer, the wildflowers she had not yet seen, the room he would build for their daughter, the life that was waiting for them on the other side of this dark night. "Don't leave me," he whispered against her fingers. "Please, not when we've just begun." In the hallway, Eli sat with his back against the wall, his lips moving in silent prayer. Jesse walked the length of the corridor with the baby in his arms, talking to her in a low, steady voice that carried through the door. Easy now, little one. Your mama is tough. Toughest person on this mountain. She'll come back to us. She has to. Whether it was Mabel's skill, Caleb's prayers, or Clara's own iron will to live, the bleeding slowed and then stopped. Her pulse steadied. Her breathing evened. The worst has passed. Mabel said her exhaustion so profound that she had to grip the bedpost to stay upright. She needs rest, but she'll recover. Only then did Caleb allow himself to look at his daughter. Jesse had placed her in the cradle he had built with his own hands, and she slept there with the peaceful indifference of someone who did not yet know how close she had come to entering the world without a mother. He lifted her carefully. So small, so impossibly light, a wisp of dark hair visible beneath the blanket, tiny fingers curled into fists no bigger than walnuts. "Hello, Elizabeth Grace," he whispered. "Your mama fought hard to bring you here safely." Clara's eyes opened heavy with exhaustion, but focused with a mother's fierce attention. "She has dark hair," she murmured, "like Weston." A pause. "But I think she has your chin." Caleb swallowed the stone in his throat. "She's beautiful, like her mother." "I was so afraid," Clara whispered. "I thought I might leave you both." "Never." The word came out with the force of a vow, which is exactly what it was. "I wouldn't have let you go." Winter always ends, and sometimes what comes after is more beautiful than anything that came before. Dr. Phineas Arden arrived before dawn, having fought his way through storm-damaged roads with the stubborn determination that characterized frontier physicians. He confirmed what Mabel already knew. Clara would recover with rest. Elizabeth was healthy and strong. "She's a fighter," the doctor told Caleb. "You're a fortunate man." "Believe me, I know." Elizabeth Grace Hawthorne conquered the ranch household with the effortless authority of a general who commands loyalty simply by existing. Mabel wept each time she held the baby, claiming the child reminded her of her own daughter at that age. Silas Redmond, a man who had ridden through Apache territory without flinching, approached the cradle with the cautious reverence of someone entering a cathedral. Emmett Boyle stood 3 feet away, at all times terrified that one wrong movement might break something so impossibly small. Jesse's transformation was the most complete and the most unexpected. The man who had argued against Clara's presence, who had questioned her honesty, and resisted her inclusion in their family became Elizabeth's most devoted guardian. He built a safety gate at the top of the stairs before the child could crawl. He carved wooden animals and lined them along her windowsill. He was caught on multiple occasions conducting serious one-sided conversations with the infant about ranch regulations, including the non-negotiable rule that no young man would be permitted to court her without first submitting to a personal interview with her Uncle Jesse. One evening, Caleb found his youngest brother in the nursery corner, holding Elizabeth against his chest and singing a folk song in a voice so low and gentle that it seemed to belong to an entirely different man. Eli appeared beside Caleb in the doorway, and the two older brothers stood watching their youngest rock the baby with the tenderness of someone handling something sacred. "Clara gave him something we couldn't," Eli said quietly. "Purpose," Caleb agreed. "Built this with our own hands. Every fence post, every floorboard, every cradle." Spring turned to summer, and life at Hawthorne Peak found a new rhythm built around the small, magnificent demands of a newborn and the steady labor of running a ranch. Clara regained her strength, gradually returning first to the household accounts, then to the garden, then to the long afternoon rides with Caleb that had become as essential to their marriage as bread and water. 3 months after Owen's departure, a letter arrived postmarked from Cheyenne, Wyoming. The handwriting was Owen's neater now than Clara remembered, as though even his penmanship was trying to improve. "I'm working a ranch near Cheyenne. The owner is a fair man. I haven't touched a drink in 2 months. I know 2 months isn't much, but it's a start. Please tell me about the baby." Clara showed the letter to Caleb. He read it, folded it, and handed it back. "2 months is better than none," he said. "Write to him about Elizabeth." She did. She described Lizzie's dark hair and blue eyes that were beginning to look like her mother's. The way she gripped any finger placed near her fist with surprising strength. The tiny knitted socks she wore made by an uncle who would deny his craft under oath. The seasons turned. They turned as they do in Montana, with a grandeur and a violence that reminded every living thing how small it was and how temporary. And through those seasons, the family that had begun with a desperate encounter on a dusty road grew and deepened and put down roots that reached toward bedrock. The second year brought expansion. Caleb purchased the property to the west, doubling the ranch's acreage. Eli's horse breeding program gained a reputation that drew buyers from as far as California. Jesse added 2 more rooms to the main house, working through the summer with an intensity that puzzled everyone until Clara finally asked him who the rooms were for. Jesse's ears went red. "For the future," he muttered, and left before anyone could ask whose future he meant. In the third year, Clara gave birth to a son. They named him Weston Caleb Hawthorne. Weston for the man who had fathered Elizabeth, because Clara and Caleb agreed that the child should know the truth when she was old enough to understand it. Caleb for the man who had chosen to be her father in every way that mattered. When Caleb held his son for the first time, his hands shook with the same overwhelming tenderness they had shown when he first held Lizzie. The blood in the boy's veins was his own, but the love was no different, not one fraction greater or lesser. Clara watched him and knew with absolute certainty that she had married a man whose capacity for love was not bounded by biology. A man keeps his word. And Caleb had promised that all children born under his roof would be his children fully and without reservation. He kept that promise every single day. By the 5th year, the Hawthorns had become fixtures in the community. Cordelia Briggs hosted a dinner in their honor, the first such invitation extended to the family. Clara attended on Caleb's arm, wearing the blue ribbon in her honey brown hair, and not a soul in the room mentioned the circumstances of her arrival. Caleb stood in the corner, uncomfortable in social settings, as he had always been, but his eyes followed Clara around the room with the quiet, constant attention of a man who could not quite believe his fortune. The 7th year brought loss. The hardest winter in memory took a third of the cattle herd. Caleb and Clara sat on the porch after the final count, saying nothing for a long time. Then Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, and the gesture contained everything that needed saying. "We'll get through this." "We always do." And they did. They rebuilt the herd. They always rebuilt. In the 10th year, Jesse Hawthorne, the man who trusted no one and expected the worst from everyone, fell in love. Her name was Sarah Prescott, a rancher's daughter from Wyoming, who had come to buy one of Eli's horses and instead found herself arguing with Jesse about fence construction within 15 minutes of her arrival. She was as stubborn as he was, as direct, and as completely unintimidated by his size and his temper. Their courtship was conducted almost entirely through disagreements, and their wedding, held under the same archway where Caleb and Clara had married, was attended by a community that had been placing bets on the outcome since Sarah's second visit. Eli remained unmarried. When Clara asked him why during one of their quiet conversations by the fire, he smiled his easy smile and shook his head. "I have a family, the biggest one in Montana. I don't need anything else." He became Uncle Eli to every child on the ranch, and eventually to every child within 3 counties. He played guitar at every gathering, carved wooden toys that became treasured possessions, and told stories by firelight that children begged to hear again and again. He was the gentle heart of Hawthorne Peak, and he never seemed to want for anything beyond the privilege of being exactly where he was. The years accumulated the way snow accumulates on mountains, layer upon layer, each one adding weight and substance until the whole became something permanent, something that would outlast the lives that built it. And then it was 1901, and 25 years had passed since a battered woman in a blue dress stood on a dusty trail and changed the course of 3 men's lives. Caleb Hawthorne was 59 years old. His chestnut hair had gone silver at the temples, and his knees protested each morning with a stiffness that took an hour of movement to work loose. But his back was still straight, his eyes still sharp, and his hands, though slower now, still carried the calluses of a working man. The years with Clara had softened the granite of his features, wearing away the hard edges the way a river wears stone, revealing something warmer beneath. Clara was 48. Silver threaded through her honey brown hair, and fine lines radiated from the corners of her storm blue eyes. But those eyes still held the same intelligence, the same quiet fire, the same ability to look at Caleb Hawthorne and see both the man he was and the man he was still becoming. She was, if anything, more beautiful than the day he had met her, because the beauty she possessed now had been earned through decades of love and labor, in the fierce, unglamorous work of building a life from scratch. Elizabeth Grace was 25. She had married young Prescott, Briggs Harlan's grandson, and together they managed the eastern section of what had become one of the largest ranches in the state. Montana had entered the Union in 1889, and the Hawthorne name was carved into its foundation as surely as it was carved into the wooden arch that still stood in the yard. Lizzie had dark hair like Weston Collier and a stubborn chin that everyone attributed to Caleb, and no one who watched them together could have guessed that the bond between father and daughter had begun not with blood, but with choice. Weston Caleb was 22, tall as his father, horse crazy as his uncle Eli. He ran the breeding program, now expanding it into Wyoming, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had been raised by people who kept their word. Jesse, at 53, had 4 children, with Sarah, all of them loud and opinionated and fearless. Mabel Aldridge had passed 3 years prior peacefully in the rocking chair by the kitchen fire she had tended for nearly 3 decades. Her absence was a wound that had scarred but never fully healed. Clara had taken the chair and placed it on the porch, and sometimes on quiet evenings, she sat in it and could almost hear Mabel's voice carrying from the kitchen, scolding someone about something with the affectionate ferocity that had held the household together through its most difficult years. Owen wrote every Christmas. He had stayed in Wyoming, had his own small spread now. 15 years sober, 2 years ago he had visited the first time brother and sister had been face to face since the morning he rode away. They stood at the ranch gate, both older, both changed, both carrying the scars of what they had survived. "I don't deserve a sister like you," Owen had said. "Maybe not," Claire replied, "but you've got one anyway." On a June evening in 1901, Caleb and Clara sat on the porch swing he had built 25 years earlier. The wood was worn smooth by decades of use, shaped to the contours of their bodies, the way a good saddle shapes to its rider. The swing creaked softly as they rocked, a sound as familiar and as comforting as a heartbeat. Grandchildren chased each other across the yard in the golden light. Lizzie's 2 and Jesse's 4, a small tribe of young Hawthorns and Briggses whose combined energy could power a sawmill. Jesse stood on the porch steps hollering at them to slow down, which they ignored entirely, as children have ignored such instructions since the beginning of time. Inside the house, Eli played guitar. The melody drifted through the open windows, a song he had played 1,000 times, familiar as the mountains themselves. Caleb looked down at his hand, intertwined with Clara's. Her fingers were still strong, still capable, still marked by the work of a lifetime spent building something that mattered. 25 years of holding this hand, 25 years of feeling it tighten around his own, when the nights were dark and the winters were long and the world pressed in from every side. "Do you remember the first day?" he asked. "On that dusty road, 3 enormous men staring down at me from horseback." "Were you afraid?" Clara laughed. The sound had not changed in 25 years. Still clear, still honest, still capable of reaching into the darkest corners of his heart and planting light. "Terror, terrified, but I was more afraid of going back than going forward." Caleb kissed her forehead. He had done this 10,000 times, and each time it carried the same weight, the same promise, the same unspoken vow that said, "I chose you, and I choose you still, and I will choose you tomorrow and every day after that until there are no more days left." "I don't regret a single day," he said. "Neither do I, even the hard ones. Winter always ends, and we're still here." The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in bands of gold and rose and deep violet, the same mountains that had watched over them since the beginning, the same peaks that had tested them with blizzards and blessed them with wildflower springs. The land had not changed, but everything else had. Caleb stood and offered Clara his hand. She took it, her small palm fitting into his large one with the practiced ease of a gesture repeated across decades. They stood together on the porch he had built, looking out over the ranch they had built, the family they had built, the life they had built, and the word that rose in Caleb's mind was not pride or satisfaction or accomplishment. The word was gratitude. He thought of a girl in a blue dress on a dusty trail, bound hands and bruised face and storm blue eyes that refused to look away. He thought of the letter Eli had written, the letter that promised a home. The letter had been imprecise. The reality was so much more than a home. It was a world entire and complete, built by people who had chosen each other when choosing was hard and had kept choosing each other every morning since. Clara leaned against him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder where it had rested 10,000 times before. They watched their grandchildren play in the wildflowers, and the evening light turned everything to gold. And somewhere inside the house, Eli's guitar carried a melody that sounded like every good thing that had ever happened in this valley, gathered into notes and offered back to the sky. She still remembered standing on that dusty trail with her wrists rubbed raw and her brother's wagon disappearing around the bend. No plan, no safety, just three bearded mountain men who had appeared on the ridge like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. The letter had promised a home. The letter had been wrong, because what she found was not merely a home. It was something so much larger and fiercer and more beautiful than four walls and a roof could ever contain. It was a love that had been earned through blizzards and births and battles and 1,000 quiet mornings of choosing each other before the sun came up. 25 years later, standing on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers, she thought that was the day my life truly began. And Caleb Hawthorne, the man who had believed for 14 years that he did not deserve happiness, looked out over the land, the family, the woman beside him, and knew that he was the richest man in Montana. Not because of acreage or cattle or the reputation his name now carried across the territory, but because of a love that had taken root in the most unlikely soil and grown stronger with every passing season, like an oak on a mountain ridge where the wind only drives the roots deeper. This is where you belong. This is where you have always belonged. The stars came out over Hawthorne Peak one by one, the same stars that had watched over the valley since before there were names for the mountains or fences on the land. The guitar music faded. The grandchildren were called inside. The porch light burned warm and steady against the gathering dark. And two people who had found each other on the worst day of their lives stood together in the quiet evening hand in hand and let the silence hold them. The kind of silence that comes not from the absence of words, but from the presence of everything that words were invented to describe, but never quite could. A man keeps his word. Caleb Hawthorne had kept every one.